Hi, I'm Catherine Lopez from National Review, and I'm here with Elizabeth Kirk and Ryan Hanlon. Elizabeth is a law professor at Catholic University, and Ryan Hanlon is at the National Council for Adoption. And Elizabeth, what's the name of the program you have at Catholic University?
So, along with my colleague Mark DiGirolami, I direct the Center for Law and the Human Person at Catholic University's Law School.
And you have a lot of great programs, some of which I've participated in and will, and a great opportunity to have a platform to talk about adoption, among other things. And today we're talking about this law review article. It's the I'm going to butcher it, but the Notre Dame Journal of Law and Public Policy.
That's
Law,
good.
ethics, and public
Ethics
policy.
and
That's
Public
right.
Policy.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you did an article together on informing choice, the role of adoption in women's pregnancy decision making, and part of what you wanted to figure out is what the title says. Why do women primarily not choose adoption when they're pregnant and probably abortion minded in many of these cases? So Elizabeth, maybe if you could start out, what surprised you the most about what you found out in this really comprehensive review of 50 states?
Yeah. Well, maybe just I'll briefly describe what got us interested
Yeah.
in this project in the first place. I mean, I've written and thought about adoption for a long time. In addition to my own scholarly work, I'm an adoptive parent and I'm also an adoptee. So, there's lots of ways in which adoption is been something I've been thinking about for a very long time. Of course, Ryan, in addition to his scholarly achievements, is the president of the National Council for Adoption. So both of us have these professional interests, and I'll let Ryan describe his own interests more. But so this paradox of, the reality that adoption as an institution is something that's very almost uniformly admired, but very rarely chosen, is something that's interested me for a long time. And this question of why adoption is not chosen really came to the forefront in the wake of the Dobbs decision, because one data point that again that I've known for a long time, but that surfaced more in the wake of that decision, is that by a ratio of 50-1, women choose to terminate a pregnancy rather than place a child for adoption. So, for every one child, every one infant placed for adoption, 50 are aborted. And so just trying to understand that dynamic at this moment in time is something that I think we were interested in figuring out. Like, why is it that women don't choose adoption? Or on the other hand, what features lead some women, admittedly very few, to choose adoption? And so bringing together my experience in law with Ryan's experience in social science, to really collect a lot of the data on women's decision making, as well as to share some new data regarding women's decision making, and to understand that dynamic, that decision making moment. And then from what we learned, we then make some policy and legal recommendations. So that's a little bit of a summary of what we were up to. I don't know, Ryan, if you want to
Yeah,
add
well,
to
let me
that in
give
any
you
way.
some of the genesis of what even led to this article. At National Council for Adoption, we were doing a different research study. We were surveying birth parents. It ended up being the largest study of birth parents ever. And as we were thinking through that project, I reached out to Elizabeth. We became friends and colleagues many years ago. I actually read something that Elizabeth wrote, and it was really poignant, really thoughtful. And I thought, who is this? And I just sent a random email, and we stayed in touch since then and have collaborated from time to time. And as we were planning this research project, and before we had even gone to what's called the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, I reached out to Elizabeth and just said, what questions would you have for birth parents, and how do you and we sent her a draft of what we were looking at, and there was a lot of overlap, but she suggested a question that we hadn't thought of, which was to ask very specifically about what options birth mothers considered during their pregnancy. And so that's one of the data points that we share. It's a unique data point that's now the only time it's been reported is in this law review article. And as Elizabeth and I talked through it and in what she was, thinking about, she wanted to know, how do birth moms make this decision? What are the alternatives that they're considering? We know the end result when we consider, all pregnant women, because we can get stats on how many women have a live birth, how many women, choose to terminate a pregnancy, how many women, place for adoption. We know that, but we don't always know their decision making. And so we added that as one of many questions when we surveyed. And then Elizabeth and I looked at that data later, and that was one of the things that we explored in this law review article. Like Elizabeth, I'm also an adoptive parent. I've worked before I was at National Council for Adoption. I worked for an adoption agency for many years. And so I'm also thinking about this from the lens of what's it like working at an adoption agency, or what's it like as just as a parent who might be talking to any of my children, including the child who joined our family through adoption one day. And so really this was for me a really fun project and really interesting, and it really is great to collaborate, as Elizabeth said, her bringing that law professor angle. I'm trying to bring in that kind of social work, social science angle, and melding them together here.
And Elizabeth, to what extent did your findings confirm what you expected, and to what extent were you surprised by new avenues that need to be explored?
So I think it might be helpful. Maybe it might be helpful to take a step back, and Ryan, if you could maybe describe that section 2, what we did find, and then maybe I can circle back to answer that question.
Sure.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
So in terms of those findings, that first question of what were the options considered by birth mothers. So, just for the audience watching, everyone who answered this question chose to place for adoption. So that's the end outcome. We're saying during your pregnancy, what did you consider? And we asked them, did you consider all your options, abortion, adoption, parenting, all at the same time? Did you first make a decision about whether or not to terminate the pregnancy and then consider your alternative options? Did you only consider, for example, adoption and parenting, or abortion and adoption, or only consider adoption? And what Elizabeth and I had talked about this, we had both expected that this was a really seriated decision-making process. First, we're going to make a decision, am I going to terminate? Then I'm going to make a decision, am I going to parent? Then, and that was true for some women, and that was true for a fifth of the women who responded, but another fifth were, so they considered all their options at once. Over a quarter, so they considered adoption and parenting. Another 10% considered abortion and adoption. So it really was quite a wide mix, a lot more heterogeneous in terms of the responses than I know I expected. And interestingly, I think for your audience, over half of the women considered abortion. So this is not just a pro-life versus pro-choice, and only those who are pro-life are making this decision. A lot of pro-choice birth mothers end up choosing adoption for their own reasons, and that would be an interesting study in and of itself. But this population is not very easily defined, certainly by their just that decision-making process.
Yeah, and I think to this particular data point about the kind of order of decision making, and us finding that it's quite diverse and there's not one way that women make decisions. I think it wasn't necessarily surprising to me, but I think it is new, right? It's a new insight because so often those who reject promoting adoption do so because they say, it's been described as the choice of the choiceless. Something that women only choose if they're denied an abortion and, absolutely can't parent or whatever. And so it's really something that women would never freely choose. And so I think this data really demonstrates that most women who do place for adoption did consider a variety of options along the way, and it wasn't the choice of the choiceless. Mm-hmm. And so that information, combined with knowing what we already know, which is that women who place for adoption, who experience their choice as free and informed, report the highest levels of satisfaction with their decision, right? That started to give us a picture of what policy ought to look like, right? Policy around adoption ought to look like giving women, as much information, accurate, non-coercive information about this choice so that they can make that fully informed decision that they report, gives them the greatest satisfaction.
So in order,
Catherine,
go ahead, Brian.
Do you mind if I jump in on that? Because
Please.
That actually is one of the other data points that we shared around the non-coercive decision-making element. And the way Elizabeth and I have formatted this in our paper is we actually present the data by time period for the women who placed for adoption. So we break out the 1970s and earlier, and we compare that to the 1980s and the 1990s and the 2000s and then 2010 and later. And it is really striking to me, a very compelling, well, they'll make fun of me for saying, a social science table is compelling or interesting. But I look at it, I find it really very, very interesting because of how striking the trend is. In the 1970s and earlier, around half of the women said they did not make a free, non-coerced decision. And we can talk about that, what that time period looked like. A lot of times what that looked like was parents wanting the best for their daughter and telling her essentially, here's what's going to happen, because they thought that was, going to be good for her and good for the child. But just over or 50% said they did not make a free, non-coerced decision. Since 2010 and later, very few women are saying that they did not, make a coerced, that they made a coerced decision. Almost all of them said it was free and non-coerced. And every decade, it's just getting better and better in that regard. So very, very clear trend that we're in that sense moving in the right direction. Obviously, we all want to get to that point of zero where women are saying they weren't coerced at all. The difference between what adoption looks like 2010 and later to the 1970s is, just radically different in terms of the role that birth parents played in their own decision, and how they feel about that later, what their satisfaction level is, Elizabeth was getting at.
Yeah. And then the other, sorry.
Go ahead, please.
I was just going to say that to sort of complement this insight into women's decision making, we also did a review of existing social science literature regarding adoption, and just again kind of revealed what I think, Catherine, you and I have talked about a number of times, this stigma, right, against adoption. And so these, in addition to the decision-making process, right, there's these external or cultural factors regarding adoption. And there's also just a lot of prevalent confusion about conflating placing an infant for adoption with the foster care system, for example. And so that, contributes to the milieu of uninformed decision-making in this regard.
One of the things you looked at are informed consent laws, which of course are how a main way that women and girls can make an informed decision, obviously. What did you find, and what improvements can be made?
Yeah, so we looked at all 50 states abortion-specific informed consent laws. So, of course, in order to, receive any kind of treatment or procedure, a person must provide informed consent, meaning that they have to be informed about, the nature of the procedure, the reasons for getting the procedure, the alternatives to the procedure, the risks or the benefits of the procedure, right? And then all of that comprises the information. They also have to be free from coercion. They have to have the capacity to make the decision, et cetera. So we looked at really that informed piece, like what information are women given in the context of seeking to terminate a pregnancy. And abortion is a bit different than other medical procedures in that the alternatives, right, to seeking an abortion are to parent or to place for adoption. So unlike some medical procedures where the alternatives might be this chemo drug or that chemo drug or abstaining from a chemo drug, here providing a woman with a fully, with all of the information she needs to make the decision includes, here are resources should you wish to parent. Here are resources should you wish to make an adoption decision. And so we looked at all 50 states to see if, in fact, they do give women that full, robust information about adoption. And what we found was that many states do not require any information at all to be given to women about adoption. Of the states that do require information to be provided, it's really, just a sort of line in a pamphlet that says, here are some resources. But some of the resources are confusing in the sense that they might lead a woman to the foster care system, right? So that, again, they're almost contributing to the prevalent confusion that we found. Only 3 states require robust information to be provided to women about adoption. And so we look a little bit more closely at those states. And then from that, we recommend that states either enact, if they don't have it at all, or amend their informed consent laws so that women have this accurate information about adoption when considering whether to have an abortion.
And the foundation of this flowed from looking at the social science research, not just what are birth parents' understanding of adoption, but what is the general understanding for women who are considering adoption or experiencing an unintended pregnancy. What is their understanding of adoption? And as Elizabeth was getting at, there's a lot of confusion, conflating private domestic adoption with a child being in foster care was a common outcome, but so was the lack of understanding that there are that women can actually choose who the adoptive parents are going to be.
Right.
They don't understand how private domestic adoption works. They think there's far more children in need of adoption than there are parents who would be open to adopting them, when the reverse is true when we're talking about private domestic adoption. And they don't understand even the ability and the prevalence of an open adoption relationship where there's an ongoing relationship that they would have with their child that they place for adoption, where you would have an ability to maintain communication, to get updates, to know how their child's doing, and to have a real relationship with their child, to be able to answer that child's questions about why I chose to place for adoption, why what the circumstances of my life were, to share information about medical history. All these women expressed a lot of fear for their child, that wasn't based in the reality of how adoption works.
And maybe it doesn't need to be said, but obviously we're dealing with situations that are so intimately emotional. And so when we're talking about fear, we're talking about fear about the most fundamental issues. And women really believing that a child would be better off eliminated by abortion than wind up in the foster care system, which is what they frequently think adoption is. And so I say that in part because we have these debates and public policy discussions, and sometimes I think we forget, not the two of you, but it just can be lost in the overwhelming nature of the news cycles, that we're dealing with these most intimate issues, but also because it underscores the import of what you just did, and I do have to say, the two of you, both of you have more than full-time jobs and family lives, and it is, you didn't have to do this. I'm so grateful you did this. You both probably felt like you had to do it because you had these questions that needed to be answered, but thank you for doing this work, because I think it can bear a lot of fruit if we make use of it, so thank you for doing that. When you look at this and the findings, what are your recommendations? And I want to start with we're having this conversation. You conducted this research post Dobbs for a reason. So we're 3 years out from the Dobbs decision, which ended Roe versus Wade, of course, and there is more confusion than ever. And I do think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but informed consent laws, I mean, 3 states, Elizabeth, 3 states, that seems like low-hanging fruit. And it seems like something that should be a bipartisan, easy thing to do. That's easier said than done, because once abortion enters any conversation, all bets are off and everybody goes to the sidelines. But what is your pitch for informed consent laws? And is that am I right to say that's the low hanging fruit public policy takeaway from this article? Elizabeth, do you want to start? Or
yeah, no, I mean, I think that it's it is, I would think, and I think Ryan and I really did our best in this article to make clear that we view this information as helpful to women regardless of one's view on abortion, right? We think that women, again, they report themselves that having robust, accurate information helps them to make a good decision. And so I would think, and I would hope, especially in this post-Dobbs fraught moment, that this might be a way where people could come together, right? This is a moment in which people on all sides of this issue really need to think about what is best for women. And this article is an effort in that regard, right? And so I think it's something that in the right state could be a low-hanging fruit and a way for both sides of the aisle to come together. In Louisiana, for example, when they're one of the 3 states, it was a bipartisan effort. Now, Louisiana is a bit of a unicorn in that regard, right. But I think it could be a model, right, for Democrats and Republicans to come together to just develop policy that is good for women based on sound social science. But I think there are other ways. I mean, I think you mentioned these ways in which just the culture generally has these confusions. I think we recommend in our article, although we don't develop them to the same extent, but we recommend funding, for example, state health education curricula to include information about adoption. We think that physicians and medical professionals who are often on the front line of helping women in these situations, we recommend funding options counseling for them so that they can better serve women who are facing this kind of decision. So we don't just think this is addressed in one way, right? There are lots of different policy ways aside from legislation, I think, that could get at this dynamic.
That, just to build from that, my answer to your question, Catherine, would be exactly the same if the Dobbs decision had been decided differently. My answer is the same in a red state or a blue state, in a permissive state or a prohibitive state. Why? Because the need is there in every state to have better information, and that's what this article was trying to highlight. Is our ability to get better information will allow a informed choice. Now, in some states, there are fewer legal choices than in other states, but we still don't have an informed choice if we don't understand adoption really at all. And so that's where we came at this, is to say we want to ensure that women understand this. In many of them, most of them aren't going to choose adoption. And we're not here to say they made the wrong choice there. They should have chosen adoption. The primary choice that women make when faced with an unplanned pregnancy is they choose to parent. That's the primary choice that's made. And what we want to ensure is that wherever they're at, they've considered the accurate information about adoption. Many of them, I think, will choose it. And if they get really accurate information about adoption and they say, you know what, I'm going to parent, they've made a better choice for themselves than to just have been informed. And so, as Elizabeth said, educating medical professionals how they can talk about this in a non-directive way, that's going to be important. Bringing this into a school curricula where we can learn about this when you're not in a moment of crisis, but you just have a better understanding. I think that can be important. But places like pregnancy resource centers very rarely bring up adoption as a potential option. And again, not to be directive and tell women that they should choose that, but to allow them to consider that as an option, and to just have accurate information. Even if they end up not choosing that, they've made a better decision for themselves and for their child.
Um, Not a few people who are watching this video, I expect, are pro-life and are pro-life activists involved in one way or another, whether it's on the front lines in pregnancy resource centers or on public policy or whatever it is. And one thing, Brian, you just hit on, and Elizabeth and I've talked a lot, including recently, about is yes, very often if you're a saintly volunteer who works at a pregnancy resource center, you may not bring up adoption at all, because it's hard enough to convince a woman who's in crisis, who's feeling desperate, that she can be a mom. To add on this whole other loaded, stigma-filled issue, is sometimes can just seem not only impossible but self-defeating. If now you're adding in this emotionally loaded, confused with foster care issue, it just seems like it's worth not bringing it up at all. Obviously that doesn't lead to a fully informed consent decision, and it eliminates a very viable option. Based on this research and your experiences, working in these fields and your lives with people, what's your advice on how pro-lifers specifically can take this article, take your findings, and help women better?
Well, at a pregnancy resource center, I would say there is a way to talk about adoption that doesn't need to scare someone away, and can help them understand that what they're doing is providing, helpful counseling and, basic information, not trying to talk someone into anything,
Right.
not trying to be directive, but it can work, it does work, and it's just not often tried. As you said, there's a fear of scaring someone away. And, so I would encourage these pregnancy resource centers to reconsider that approach and to look for a model of training their workers on how they can provide this counseling in a way where they're asking open-ended questions, where they're, offering, basic information without being prescriptive and without, driving someone they're trying to support away from receiving the help that they're looking for.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think, at least anecdotally, it seems that many pregnancy resource centers do not train their staff on adoption counseling. And again, in my experience, many even kind of, well-meaning, pregnancy resource directors and staff report that they just don't touch it because they're afraid that it'll make a woman more abortion minded, but also that they don't feel equipped to handle it. And I think that's the case, as I said, for medical professionals and others who, encounter women And so I think just a really, if you're running a pregnancy resource center, I think investigating, training your staff on how to have this conversation, as Ryan said, in a non-directive way, but in a way that provides a woman with accurate, robust information. Also, I know of some pregnancy resource centers that have actually uh, um, included birth mothers as counselors or as on staff, people that can be available to just share their own experience with the decision. And I think birth mothers themselves can be very powerful witnesses for the difficulty of the choice, but perhaps also the ways in which it was a healing or a healthy choice as well.
And the issue of birth mothers is something, and this is something we've talked about over the years. Birth mothers, there's a stigma, and there's a shame that is often associated, and it's just sort of built in culturally. It probably it's natural too in many regards because there is this rupture that happens, obviously, in adoption that's not natural. And I know I'm a big fan of that group Brave Love out of Dallas, which celebrates birth mothers, tells the stories through video campaigns, but also like literally has parties, thank you parties for birth mothers in different states. And part of the idea is just to say, look, you've done a beautiful thing here. It's a self-sacrificial, beautiful thing, and that's an important piece, isn't it? Just for a healthy polity, but also for the pro-life movement to really consider, because if women are feeling like this 20 years after they've chosen adoption, if they're feeling shame and regret, and the regret is like self-imposed almost because of so many different cultural and other factors. Yeah, how do we combat that better? And that needs to be a pro-life priority, doesn't it?
I also really like the work of Brave Love, and along with the work that you mentioned, they're providing support groups there where these women can get together, talk about their experiences. You're right, Catherine, that there is a lot of stigma. That stigma has actually increased in more recent decades because adoption's more out in the open than it used to be.
Right.
And on the whole, I think adoption being more open is a good thing. But one of the results is that birth parents and birth mothers in particular are then more susceptible to societal stigma. When we researched this in a separate study, what we found was the source that was most prevalent in terms of stigma was a birth parent's extended family and friends. And so this often is coming, close to home for them. And what birth mothers say is that other birth mothers are the ones who really understand them best. And so that's what I love about that support group setting is that they can get together around a table, around a meal, and feel like they're being heard and supported. Your question, that larger societal response, couldn't agree more. I think we can do more to support, the whole adoption network. But in particular, I see a lot of campaigns. What can we do to support adoptees? Campaigns. What can we do to support adoptive parents? It's not the same when we talk about birth parents, and I think it should be. And we should be able to talk about this in a much more open way than we do. One of the exercises I've done more recently when I'm speaking to groups about adoption is I ask an audience, I say, everyone raise your hand if you know an adoptive parent, and virtually everyone raises their hand. And I'll say, okay, now raise your hand if you know an adoptee. And most people there raise their hand. And I'll say, raise your hand if you know a birth parent. And all the hands go down.
Mm.
Every adoptee has two birth parents. In theory, we should know more birth parents than we know adoptees, but that's not the case because we as a society are uncomfortable talking about this. And I think the response is sunlight and transparency and having conversations like this where we can you just acknowledge some basic truths and to not make this into a situation where someone who is a birth parent is going to feel very uncomfortable or very judged simply by the nature of a decision that they made at a recent or past, period of their life.
Yeah, I'll just add to that I think, this is not, I think, a piece of the puzzle that law and policy can necessarily address fully or fix. I think education can go a long way towards normalizing and even celebrating, the choice of adoption. But one of the really poignant anecdotes that we share in the section on the paper on this external pressure and the stigma is this story of this young woman who lived in a home for, I think it was for pregnant teens, and she had made an adoption plan, but she kept it secret from all of her housemates. And when she went to the hospital to have the baby and returned without the baby, she went through with her adoption plan. She lied to her housemates and told them that the baby had been taken by social services. So it was more palatable for her to for her peers to think that her baby had been taken from her by the state than for them to think she had made an adoption placement. And that, I think, is such a heartbreaking story, and really reveals, I think, as a culture, a problem, right? That we need to have the free choice to place a child for adoption seen as quite different than your child being removed from you by the state.
And in that situation, that poor gal should have been celebrated for making this brave decision. I especially speaking
And
as
supported. I mean, to Ryan's point, and
supported, yes,
supported, right?
Supported, because it's also
But
a very difficult
yeah,
decision, and
yeah.
right.
there are, the primary thing that I hear anecdotally, but also we've seen in the research, is that birth parents say this is a decision that for them is joy mingled with grief. This is not just a happy decision that is only to be celebrated. It's also something that is really difficult for them, that can for them can kind of come and go in terms of how it's impacting them. But it's something that they think about throughout their life. It's not just a decision in time and then they move on. It's something they continue to very much care for and love their child, and they view the decision they made as a decision of love, for their child. And that's why so many birth parents want to maintain a relationship, is because they feel that strong love and that strong connection. And we often don't provide them the same resources and support to do that as we do for the adoptive parents and for the adoptee. And I think there is more that we can do there. I agree with Elizabeth. We're not going to solve this issue, certainly not stigma through law and policy, but we could offer the same supports or perhaps even more supports for that population as we do for others involved with adoption.
One thing that keeps coming up during this conversation and comes up during every conversation I think I've ever had about adoption is the education piece of it and how ill-informed people are. Ryan, you're sitting on this tremendous organization that is a resource, and I'd like to ask your advice, again, particularly but not exclusively, to pro-lifers who are active, whether it's at pregnancy centers or in public policy, um, but also just individuals who, as Elizabeth and I recently experienced, and we've all experienced in different venues, even people who are actively trying to help abortion-minded women choose life, have no clue about the adoption resources there are. So, I mean, just a very practical, even commercial-like standpoint here. Ryan, how do we make more use of your organization, the National Council for Adoption?
Well, thank you for that question. It's not a commercial because I'm not trying to sell anyone on anything. There are free resources where one can go and get information about adoption, to get accurate information about adoption, and to understand, what that looks like. There's free trainings on how to provide counseling or non-directive information about adoption. And that's true for everyone, regardless of their ideology and approaching the pregnancy decision-making process. get information about adoption and serve your clients well. I mean, when we talk to medical professionals, they say we just never even bring adoption up because we don't know how to. We don't know how to even talk about this. They're, you know, and they're doing their clients a disservice if that's the case, because their clients deserve to have all of their options in front of them so they can make a decision. And medical professionals, that's their duty, is to be able to provide that information, and their feeling when they leave that, as a non-option. So, you can go to our website, adoptioncouncil.org, and find plenty of free trainings, including about private domestic adoption and what that looks like. Get also accurate information about what the adoption process entails, so that uh, expectant parents have an understanding of what that would mean for them, what it means to be able to choose who the adoptive parents are, and then how to find a really good provider that can provide support and counseling to help make a decision. One thing I think your audience might not know, and it surprises a lot of people that I talk to, adoption agencies who do private domestic adoption, the majority of the clients they counsel don't choose adoption.
Mm.
So adoption agency workers are often vilified. Oh, you're just trying to, take people's children, and you're this, big, horrible, industry. These are usually small nonprofits who provide a lot of counseling, and they help expectant parents better understand adoption. Some choose to place for adoption. The majority don't. And but they've gotten good information, often support along the way, so that they can feel better about their decision making. And for those that do end up placing for adoption, they've got someone who's in their corner to supported them through part of the pregnancy, and is available after the placement to provide ongoing support.
We only have a few minutes left. So taking this article, what are maybe Elizabeth start and then Ryan, what do you hope comes from this? What do you hope policymakers do with it? Pro-lifers, family, just people interested in building families, helping families flourish, helping women flourish. How do you hope people make use of this article and its findings?
Yeah, well, I think, not a lot of people read law review articles.
Right.
So I want to have a healthy, realism about this. But I do think that this article, in all humility, is very practical and should be the exception, right? I really encourage any policymaker, legislator, anyone connected, but also people who are just concerned, right, about the problems facing the family and women today, to take a look at trying to understand better women's decision making. Again, going back to what I said at the beginning, I think that this moment, this post-Dobbs moment, where we see so much continued dissension around this issue, this is the opportunity to understand better the pressures on women, what leads them to choose abortion, what leads them to choose to parent, what constraints do they feel. And this article really tries to get at that and contributes to better understanding that. And so I think that's just one really important takeaway, is just for people to try to understand better what women are facing. And then a second very practical takeaway would be to think about ways that law and policy, or even the way that your organization, your pregnancy resource center operates, could respond to this greater information about women's decision making.
And
if I can just interrupt for a second,
Yeah.
I just want to say I don't normally have host conversations about law review articles, because I know people don't read them, but there is something about this moment. First of all, I do believe that this is an accessible piece, but even more importantly, this is this moment where all hands need to be on deck, and frankly pushing back against all of the confusion and disinformation with actual practical realities about what women are facing, what they need. And again, whether you're pro-life or pro-choice or somewhere in between, or don't want to label most of us really just want to make sure that women in difficult situations have options. And this is the meeting ground where I think this article is useful. And Ryan, sorry.
Yeah, no, I'm on the same page with that. And this, this is a bipartisan issue, and this can remain a bipartisan issue. I think the data we are sharing for the first time shows that this is not a pro-choice versus pro-life, where it's only one or only another. Those that are involved with adoption are going to be across the political spectrum, across their various social values and views. And what we can agree on is that everyone deserves accurate information. No one should be coerced into a decision making. Right now, unfortunately, the large majority of Americans don't have an accurate understanding of how private domestic adoption works. And so all of us, regardless of our differences, hopefully can agree, it's in everyone's interest to do a better job of having accurate information and having better informed decisions, follow from that.
And I also want to add, and I shouldn't add this at the end of this conversation, but I find, particularly in conservative circles and pro-life religious circles, that there's sometimes a hesitancy to deal with adoption and adoption agencies and some big names at all, because there's this concern that there will be ideological differences, and some fundamental ones involving children and sexual politics and all of these things. I just want to also underscore too, like, being not afraid to push back against all of that, which are obviously fundamental debates we're having in our culture. But at the same time, there are desperate pregnant women. There are also children whose lives are on the line here. These are and then if we get into foster care, there are children who need homes. And I often think we need to be adult enough to be able to live in the reality where people are having these debates, and we're having these debates in some cases. But we also should be able to deal with, and need to, it's absolutely imperative that we help women with their actual needs in real time. It's just like the human thing to do.
Yeah, that's right, Catherine. And just last week, we at our organization, NCFA, National Council for Adoption, wrapped up a conference where we had adoption agencies from across the country together. And that's a diverse group. I mean, it's not who your viewers might think. There are, religious organizations there. There are non-religious organizations there. There are agencies who provide, abortion referrals. There are agencies who never, bring up abortion, and everything in between. There are adoption agencies in, every state that are going to serve clients very differently and are going to be a better fit for different populations. And so I think you're right that if there's a, expectant parent out there who's, feels desperate, they're going to have certain, providers who they're going to be more comfortable working with. That's going to be true for adoptive parents or prospective adoptive parents as well. And I think the professional community needs to do a good job of meeting these clients where they're at, especially those who are feeling like they're in a desperate situation. Our primary goal should be not making a decision for them or directing them towards a decision, but helping meet that need and helping resolve a crisis. That's what it looks like a lot of times for adoption agencies. Someone comes to them in a place of desperation. They're helping, them understand short, medium, and long-term implications of their decision, and helping them look for the resources and support they need in that moment and in the days, weeks, and months to come.
One of the most encouraging things I've actually found in the last, I don't know, 10 years, of talking a bit about these issues and talking about them sometimes in the context of religious freedom, is the number of people who I disagree with on some fundamental issues, who say, you know what, we need more choices rather than less at this moment. And so understanding the need for that diversity. So if you feel comfortable with with a Catholic organization or an organization that'll place with same-sex couples. Like you have these options, and obviously there's so many different debates, but just merely in terms of giving people options and making sure people know what their options are. I think that's something that I found encouraging in recent years. Elizabeth, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, well, as you were both having this really important conversation, I just kept thinking that one thing that I think is always important to keep in mind with respect to adoption is that the child is the center of it. You know, we spent a lot of time in our article and in this conversation talking about the needs of women, and that's obviously really important. But adoption really is ordered towards the need of a child who needs parents, right? And so I think whether it's adoption getting conflated with foster care so that women don't make accurate decisions, or whether it's adoption getting lumped in with these other social, you know, contested questions, such that adoption sort of gets, you know, a sort of bad rap because it's connected to these other questions. I think one way of steering clear of those controversies is to always see adoption as a remedy, right? It doesn't cause these underlying problems. It's a response, and a healing response, and one that I think a healthy political structure and a healthy society should support.
Well, thank you. Oh, Brian. All right. I lied.
Well
You can
said,
have the last word if you want.
No. Elizabeth had a great one.
Last word.
There. Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth Kirk from the Catholic University Columbus School of Law, and Ryan Hanlon from the National Council for Adoption. The two of you, I'm just so grateful for the work you do. And I'm fond of both of your families. In addition to your work, thank you for everything you do. Thank you for having this conversation. And I'm Catherine Lopez from National Review and the National Review Institute. And please keep coming to us for more conversations like this. This won't be the last conversation we have about adoption. Thanks.
Thank you.